Welcome to Unlike Minded, a sci-fi audio anthology.
India Garden, Tandoor and Tikka by Cheech Manohar. On their second date, Archie informed Vish that it was remarkably easy to receive an A from the Department of Public Health. You had to proceed with an abundance of caution, he warned, because restaurants got away with all kinds of nonsense. Hairs in food, even flooding toilets wouldn't be enough to ruin the curve. They would still be able to brag to the world that they were a safe place to eat by way of a lying little placard tucked neatly into the corner of their front display. For an establishment to warrant a B, it would have to contain something truly heinous. How downright medieval it all was over there across the ocean. Thank goodness Fish had the sense to leave. Frankly, it's because you Americans have no standards. They slept together for the first time later that night. As Vish unstuck himself from Archie's damp, hairless body, he was still puzzling out what could possibly be worse than flooding toilets. After enough time had passed that Vish could plausibly deny that he had not been thinking about it while Archie was inside of him, he asked Archie what a bee could mean. Most likely rats. Archie tossed over his shoulder, assuming his rightful place as Little Spoon. Rats? Rats? For years to come, Vish would see rats in every room he walked into. Tiny paws skittering wherever they please, knocking over teacups, buck teeth squirming upwards in sacks of rice, thieves in the night, constantly operating on the periphery of his terror. Was that a tale? Was that? He would walk on his tiptoes in subway stations. He would hold his breath when opening his own fridge. And yet the word had been flicked so carelessly off Archie's finger. Like a jaunty scarf. Like a soft brown turd. The thought did not occur to Vish that perhaps Archie was misinformed, or misremembered, or was just flat out wrong. Perhaps it was the way that Archie's words always stacked so neatly next to each other, with no gaps or bumps, everything just so, that made him so sure of Archie's sureness. His people did invent the language after all. When Archie spoke, it was fact, regardless of whether or not it was true. Archie once met a boy named Vishal and declared, "Well, Vish has a sort of ring to it, no?" And so the boy was Vish, a fact as untrue as the sound of paws beneath his bed. But the India Garden Tandoor and Tikka had a 4 rating. Vish could read the lying little placard from his and Archie's bedroom window and hadn't the slightest idea what it meant. When Vish had first moved to London, he noticed that the English people took a specific pride in doing everything just slightly askew, and then claiming that it was in fact the original way of doing things. And the Food Standards Agency rated food hygiene on a scale of 0 to 5. Apparently a 4 meant good. That was easy enough to understand. Surely a 4 was safe. But then a 5 meant very good. Does a 5 equate to an A? Is a B the same thing as a 4? Where do flooding toilets fall on the scale, a 3.2 or a 4.4? Was there a conversion system that could translate the Food Standards Agency to the Department of Public Health? Like the mental calculation of turning pounds to dollars that Vish did when he used to go out drinking. It didn't matter. He always ended up over-tipping. The sight of the cracked awning embarrassed Vish. It was just so conspicuous. The sign was one thing. At the turn of winter, it was the only green thing left in the neighborhood, maybe even the country. It was a green that bragged about itself, that called out to the surrounding grays and browns and grays and hollered, "Look, sir, look how green I am." But he could conceivably ignore the hullabaloo if it weren't for the horrifying shade of orange the proprietors had chosen for the building itself. Tangerine, apricot. Vish imagined a giant studious hand coming down from the sky and highlighting the building like an annoying footnote that would be on tomorrow's test. Sunset, safety cone. Even as the weather fought valiantly against the paint, the color refused to retreat. It stood its ground even as the building crumbled around it. Despite its convenience, Vish avoided eating there out of sheer principle. He prayed every night as he fell asleep that the endless rain would grant him mercy and baptize the eyesore anew. But the rain betrayed him. There is a time of night when any news is bad news. Vish heard it first, and Archie heard him hear it. No. Arch. No. In defense of Archie, this was a reasonable response. Fish had what Archie called selective insomnia. Fish had the unique ability to sleep through cars backfiring and neighbors lovemaking and 7 individual alarms, each occurring 9 minutes apart. It would have been a useful skill if he weren't counterintuitively woken up by sounds practically indistinguishable from silence. God forbid a leaf rustle or a clock tick, Vish would rev from dream to panic in just the time it took for him to open his eyes. He would then proceed to throw on all the lights, stand in the center of his bed, and ask Archie to check for rats. He would first make Archie shine his flashlight under the bed, the most obvious place for monsters. Then Archie was to inspect all the baseboards, to make sure there were no gaps large enough for an intruder to squeeze through. Then behind the radiators, then behind the stove, then every cabinet, then every drain. Then Vish would ask Archie if he was sure there were no droppings. Then he would ask Archie if he was sure he knew what droppings looked like. Then, to stop Vish from showing him pictures of droppings on his phone, Archie would offer to make Vish some chamomile tea. Then Vish would fall asleep while the kettle was brewing, leaving Archie wide awake. Vish heard it again. Archie! Vish, if you make me get out of this bed, I will break up with you. I will break up with you, and I will take your striped jumper with me. And so Vish went in search of the invisible sound. Bed, baseboards, radiators. On his way to the stove, he felt it underfoot. His first thought was how guilty Archie would feel, knowing that this time, he was right. This time he had heard the rats. They had toyed with him all this time, playing with their food, all to make this moment just that much more spectacularly horrific. His second thought was to scream bloody murder, alerting a concerned dog across the street in the process. But in the stark fluorescence of his kitchen, he did not find a wicked tail disappearing down the sink. Nope, the great villain that stood before him was a puddle of water. A sizable puddle, but a puddle. Plink! A hole in his ceiling winked out the last dregs of that evening's rain, which was currently climbing its way through his sock. He stood there and let himself be invaded from above and below, full body shivering in the relief of being attacked by something he understood. It took everything in him not to burst into laughter. On his hands and knees, Vish dried the floor with a joy that he had only experienced once before while under the influence of a particularly strong painkiller. He stood on a chair to examine the ceiling for wet spots and found none. No bubbling paint either. Just a perfect 1-inch circle missing from his roof, through which the stars winked at him. He did not feel quite so in on the joke anymore. Trembling, he craned closer for evidence of a miniature evil gnashing its way into his territory. Bite marks, perhaps, or a dropping planted like a flag. There weren't any, but Vish found himself atop the chair 2 more times before he was certain, or near certain, at least. From the cold oven, he retrieved a stainless steel bowl. He ran his thumb along the lip of the vati, finding the engraving. The lilting script danced around his comprehension. He had a rudimentary understanding, but had missed the window in which he could learn the language seriously. Though he had asked his Ai many times what it said, he could never seem to hold the phrase in his mind or in his mouth. He would sit on a low stool while she rolled the bori into perfect circles, using nothing more than a thin wooden dowel. Clumsy syllables would bumble their way around his tongue and dribble down his tank top. Again, she would say, and again he would try. This time, you will remember it, she would assure him. She acted as though they both had all the time in the world to just sit on that stool and roll the boris and pass sweet words back and forth. Why then had she forced him out of the home with such quickness, with barely time to register it was happening? The vati was meant to come to him anyway. It was meant to be gifted, passed along after years of love and tradition, not stolen in haste, thrown in a backpack separated from the rest of the set. After all this time, he still couldn't parse out whether he had taken it for his benefit or so that she should feel the loss. Vish placed the bowl beneath the drip and found his way back to Archie, who was placidly slipping through an unbothered mind. Had he slept through the whole ordeal? No, he had woken up for a moment, yes? They'd had a conversation right before his near-death experience. Shouldn't he have been roused when Vish screamed? But on second thought, did he actually scream? Vish thought he had read an article once, fine, listened to a podcast, where someone had said something about the mind inventing responses the body was incapable of due to shock. What was that mental gymnastics called? Archie would know. Vish would ask him in the morning. He crawled against the warmth of Archie's body and kissed his shoulder, his damp socks a reminder that he was safe. The dog across the street barked through the night, steady as a metronome. It ran through Vish's dreams, brandishing a table lamp and clad in Archie's blue cotton boxers, ready to pounce at the first sign of danger. Seasons work differently in London. There was a season in between autumn and winter in which the weather had firmly crossed the threshold into barren sludge, but the people still adhered to some predetermined arbitrary timeline and insisted it was autumn. Vish was not fooled, though. The signs were there. He could feel the telltale wolf whistle of the incoming chill through the hole in his ceiling. Some clever escape artists had already flown south to warmer lands. Among them, Vish's property manager would not be able to patch it up until he returned. Vish was instructed to avoid using the kitchen. He tried to explain that it was not as serious as that, just a small, round opening, as if someone had pulled a cork out of the roof. But Vish's property manager struggled to hear him over the sounds of ocean breezes and children frolicking on his end of the call. It wasn't just the heat that leaked out of his body. The longer the gap went unfixed, the more Vish felt a profound emptying of his being. Partially, it was the mundanity of it all, the fact that the inside and the outside were no longer distinguishable by temperature. Partially, it was the constant terror that some small critter may crawl through the hole and descend upon him via aerial strike. Mostly, it was nausea, because Archie had insisted on takeaway from his favorite pub for the 5th time in 2 weeks. Vish had taken to moving the pasty mess around on his plate until the episode of gentle detective television they were watching was through, then clearing away the dishes before Archie noticed. So, when a nudge from an incoming pram caused the paper bag in Vish's hand to rip, and the 6th shepherd's pie, extra peas, and fish and chips malt vinegar on the side to spill out onto the sidewalk, Vish felt equal parts rage and relief. "Terribly sorry," the woman pushing the pram offered. It was such a wholly insufficient response. The woman deposited the words into Vish's palm with such a limp wrist that she may as well have been throwing him a handful of loose coins. "This is all I have on me. Terribly sorry." She removed her oversized sunglasses from atop her head and used them to smooth back the thin blonde wisps that had come loose at her hairline. She waited with waning patience and politeness for Vish to release her from the interaction. Vish knew what he was supposed to say. No trouble at all. Such were the rules. The woman could have pulled out a revolver and shot him in the foot, and need only have said, "Terribly sorry." Vish would have hopped his way to the nearest hospital, a pained word accompanying each landing. "No, ouch, trouble, oof, all, dear God." The woman sported a pair of high-heeled trainers and a dress covered in abstract tiger stripes that made her seem both too young and too old. The dress looked expensive. He could hear his mother asking her how much she paid for it, and then responding with, "I can get it made cheaper in New Jersey." Did the woman genuinely like the dress? Or did she like how much she could spend on the dress? How much did she spend on it? What was the conversion rate from his beat-up Reeboks to her high-heeled trainers? Did she buy the dress because she saw someone else wearing the dress? Did they buy it because they saw someone else wearing it? Who wore the dress first? What shoes were they wearing? "Do you speak English?" The woman had broken protocol by speaking out of turn, and Vish no longer felt equal parts rage and relief. He popped the cork from his own belly button and emptied out the contents of his piggy bank. His restraint slid out of him, pulling with it his standards. His civility landed in a neat pile at the wheels of the pram. The mundanity, the terror, the nausea. After he had properly shook himself loose, he found that the only thing left within him was an overwhelming need to prove that he did, in fact, speak English. And so he said, "That is, without a doubt, the ugliest fucking dress I've ever seen in my life." Faced with such a clear diversion from the script, the woman had no choice but to exit their little play as fast as her high-heeled trainers would allow her. A tiny fist popped out of the pram, enjoying its new breakneck speed. It unclenched momentarily and freed a frilly pink sock unto the world. The woman did not stop to pick it up. Vish's stomach craned upwards at him and asked, "Now what?" He couldn't believe he had just spoken to a stranger that way. What had come over him? What if she knew someone who knew him? What if she knew someone who knew someone who knew him? What if the child in that pram was to be the future employer of his child someday, and had grown up hearing stories of the savage brown man that insulted his mother on the street, or attacked her? Would she exaggerate the story every time she told it until Vish, and by extension everyone who looked like him, was a beastly ogre? His soft, pliable brain matter folded around the panic and kneaded itself into a thick dough until it was all he could think about. And then Vish heard it. And then he saw it. Just the very tip of its tail, but it was unmistakable. The rat vanished around the corner with a teasing flick. "You," Vish thought. "Why are you doing this?" He began to run after it, his limbs perfect employees of his mind's orders. The rats were mocking him. In his gut, he knew it to be true. They were making a fool out of him. They were constantly disappearing, just floating out of his vision. If he could see one, not a nose or a paw, but the whole ugly thing, then Vish almost knocked over a young couple making out as he scrambled down a back alley after the blasted creature. He didn't bother with a "terribly sorry." He needed to find out where it was going, where they were always running off to after catching him at his worst, where they were laughing about him behind his back. He ran harder, the rat just barely out of reach. His legs were on fire. Sweat collected at his pits, his back, his crotch. He was grateful for the heat. He had spent so many fruitless, desperate nights trying to rid his life of these fiends. Again, and again, again, whispered his mother from the kitchen. And when the rat finally lost him, burrowing into a crack at the base of a bright orange wall, Vish knew where he was before he looked up and saw the obviously green sign. He felt duped. All this time, he thought he'd been charging after his attackers, forcing them into a corner. Instead, he had been held by the hand, led directly to their lair. How easily he had fallen for their trap. Vish could not make out why the rats had brought him here, but he knew he would not give them the satisfaction. He would march across the street and order a pizza for delivery. They would not make a fool out of him this time. Not this time. This time you will remember it. As he felt the door of the India Garden Tandoor and Tikka close behind him, he wondered how and when he had stepped inside. 2 electronic chimes sounded overhead, announcing his arrival. An elderly fry cook in a dirty polo shuffled out from the kitchen and grunted his disapproval at the sight of Vish. He then turned his attention towards an old box television, mounted precariously from the ceiling. Vish recognized the actor on screen. His family had a stack of bootleg DVDs featuring the aging Bollywood star, somehow in better shape now than he was back then. His favorite movie featured an especially filmy number where the hero danced on the beach with his heroine. Vish would rewind that scene over and over, learning all the moves, secretly wishing the actor would tackle him into the sand. Heat crawled up Vish's neck to the tips of his ears. He looked away from the television and found the fry cook staring at him, disdain and sweat dripping off his long, crooked nose. Vish was suddenly self-conscious. Had the fry cook sensed the desire within Vish, the way his parents had? The fry cook barked at him in a language he didn't understand. Vish stood there, struck dumb. The fry cook barked again. Vish was unaware of the protocol in this situation. "You are hungry?" The voice came from behind him. Nestled between a wobbly table and a fridge full of soft drinks, a girl of about 12 looked up from her calculus textbook. Sorry, what?" The dumb words clanked like ice cubes onto the peeling linoleum. Vish wished so badly he could kick them beneath the refrigerator. "You are hungry?" she clarified once again. Vish could not tell if it was meant to be a question. It seemed all sentences fought their way through the dense jungle of her accent, barely escaping with any punctuation whatsoever. But regardless, once she said it, it was true. Vish was vibrating with hunger. Had he been this hungry a second ago? In one practice sweep, The girl reached behind her, slid the fridge door open, removed a frosty bottle of mango juice from the inside, and banged it against the table. The lid popped off, flipped 3 times in the air, and disappeared entirely. Fish stared at the perfect 1 inch of space the lid used to occupy, while the girl brought the juice to her chapped, smiling lips. "What do you want to eat?" "What do you have?" "We have everything." His insides lurched forward at the promise of food. He was now properly starving. What did he want to eat? Each idea stabbed another one dead as they warred for his attention. He could focus on nothing but the smell of spice frying in oil. It settled in his nostrils, set up camp between the threads of his shirt, took refuge on his scalp, shaded by the strands of his hair. He wanted to wear the cardamom like cologne. "Just a dal tadka? For takeaway, please." "No takeaway. You sit." Fish had the distant, nagging feeling that he had to be getting back to something or someone, but sat anyway. The fry cook set a styrofoam tray in front of him. One compartment of the tray was filled with rice, the other with lentils. Did he already have it prepared for Vish? How long had Vish been here? A final question bloomed on his tongue, but he already knew the answer. "Spoon?" "No spoon. You eat." It was all the permission Vish needed. He burrowed deep into the warmth of the meal. He mixed the lentils and rice with his right hand, turmeric staining beneath his fingernails. Using the back of his thumb, he pushed mouthfuls of rice into his cheek. They slid down his throat with barely any need to chew. The flavor was subtle and spectacular. It tasted of afternoon naps and lengthy debates and old cassette tapes. It did not need any salt. Fish did not know how it could be so perfectly salted and wondered for a second if he might be crying. No sooner had he started, Vish licked each of his 5 fingers clean. It was the best meal he had had since coming to London. "More." Vish knew this time that it was not a question. There was a certainty to what was about to happen. The fry cook placed a fresh heap of steaming rice in front of Vish. He tumbled down the white mountain at full speed. At the base of the mountain, there was a thick forest of root vegetables. He gnawed through it, as though swinging a talwar at full force. And on his way out, or in, he felled great beasts and tore their meat from their bones and thanked the skies above that they had provided him with the strength to go on. He burst forth onto a black beach and found mustard seeds popping and crackling below his wild dancing. He was being warmed from within, the burn of chilies generating a heat that could not be contained, that sizzled the air around him. Finally, when it was all too much to bear, he removed his trappings and dove into an ocean of yogurt, clinging to a cucumber to keep him afloat. The fry cook placed another styrofoam tray in front of him, and then another. The trays were empty within seconds. Used and useless, they floated delicately to the floor, like falling leaves signaling the turn of the season. The notion presented itself to Vish that perhaps he should be sick by now, but there was scarcely any room for the worry to stick around. There was no space for anything within him, except his own hunger. Even though the food seemed to be ready in an instant, the fry cook could barely keep up with his demand. What was to become of him when the restaurant ran out of food? The young girl sat across from him and beheld the show. She removed the rubber band from one of her plaits and began unbraiding her frizzy hair. It grew impossibly long as it unspooled from her fingertips, a fierce mane blossoming around her face. She waited with all the patience of a parent watching their child figure out a simple truth about the universe. Eventually, the fry cook did not have the time to cook the ingredients, not that it mattered. He placed a stack of dry papadum in front of Vish and nearly lost an arm in the process. From that point on, he tossed fish with the pin bones in and chunks of raw lamb at Vish from a safe distance, who caught them midair between his furious teeth. At last, Vish turned a 20-pound bag of Royal Brand basmati rice upside down and emptied the thing into his mouth at once. As he crunched on the last grain, the despair set in. That was it. There was nothing left for him to eat. Now he was crying. The young girl reached across the table and wiped his tears with the palm of her hand. The other hand smoothed the sweat from his aching temples. He blinked, and another hand still ran through his hair. And another rubbed his belly. All the young girl's arms intertwined and uncoiled as they cared for him, reaching in every direction and back again so that she would not reveal how many she actually had. He thought he counted 8, but then a 9th and 10th brought the glass bottle of mango juice to her lips. She took one final pull of the sweet nectar, opened her mouth wide, and swallowed the bottle. The fry cook joined them at the table, which the 3 of them then proceeded to eat. Then they ate the chairs. Then they peeled the linoleum from the floor. It had the texture of dried jackfruit. They took the restaurant apart board by board, each one more flavorful than the last. The young girl pulled the sign down from the front and split it into 3 equal pieces. Vish ate the part that said Tandoor. It tasted like fire. Next, they started on the streets. The fry cook rolled them up using his spatula as they were tender and crispy dosa. The cars got stuck in Vish's teeth. He rinsed them out with the rivers, the acidity of limbu sarbat rolling around on his tongue. But then he craved something sweet, and Big Ben called out to him, a crumbling burfi in his hands. The London Eye was the gooeyest jalebi he had ever consumed. He let the syrup run down his chin. Saffron. The whole city smelled of saffron. The young girl called him over and peeled the roof off Buckingham Palace. It was a box of kazukatli, the beautiful diamonds wrapped in silver foil. They shoveled the jewels into their mouths. When he had finally finished his dessert, he craved a cup of chaha and was delighted to find the royal family sitting for afternoon tea. To his dismay, the king was rather bland. There was one bite left of London. The young girl reached one of her 6 or 8 or 10 or 100 hands down and scooped it up with the last piece of roti. She turned her eyes to Vish with such love and nodded her head indiscriminately from side to side. Vish unhinged his jaw. She used her thumb to push the food into his mouth. The goddess's offering rested on his tongue before tumbling into eternity. And Vish felt full. His eyes drooped with the weight of a meal well earned, and the final images in his mind before sleep kissed him on the forehead were from the movie he used to rewind as a child. Vish realized how silly the plot was, that the hero died halfway through, and the heroine fell in love with his long-lost twin. It was the sound of a sugar spoon being set on the dining table that woke Vish up. Fuck. Well, you should have been up hours ago anyway. Archie sat cross-legged, looking handsome and irritated in Vish's striped jumper. The haze of the morning flipped everything inside out. Vish slid out of bed, careful to make sure the floor was actually there before trusting it with his weight. For hadn't he eaten the floor just last night? Or was that 2 nights ago? Is the repairman coming today? Vish asked. Repairman? It was then that Vish realized that Archie was eating a full English breakfast. The beans mixed with the eggs and tomato to create a sickening beige paste on his plate, which Archie sopped up with a piece of toast. A kettle whistled from the kitchen, from the fully functional kitchen, complete with stainless steel appliances and a ceiling devoid of holes. Maybe it was the high pitch of the whistle, or the overwhelming beigeness of Archie's breakfast, or the fact that he had perhaps eaten a whole city the night before, but all of a sudden, he was positive he was going to be sick. And so he said, I'm going to be sick, and rushed to the bathroom. He retched over the sink, but nothing came out. He heaved until he was red-faced. He stuck a finger down his throat to help himself along, but his stomach was empty. No lentils or Ferris wheels or proof flowed out of him. He glared at himself in the mirror, enraged at his sweaty reflection, that he could so easily be fooled by his own hope. And that is when he saw the rat. Vish was taken by the sheer size of it. He had played the possibilities of this moment in his mind many times. In every iteration of his imagination, he would scream or find high ground or burst into flames or tears or both. But the creature that stood behind him was not one of the small monsters that had plagued him for years. It was a fat beast, imposing and regal. Any larger, and Vish could picture himself riding the animal off into battle. The rat pulled its round body across the floor towards Vish and sat by his feet, like any pet or servant would. It looked up at Vish with two black eyes and smiled, pleased with the serendipity that they should find themselves here with each other. And from deep within Vish, a loud, satisfied burp erupted out of his maw, and one frilly pink sock plopped into the sink. "Better out than in," the rat said. The rat followed Vish out of the bathroom, where Archie had not once looked up from his newspaper. Vish pondered what blue cotton boxers would taste like. From across the street, the India Garden Tandoor and Tikka watched Vish unhinge his jaw. Another satisfied customer, despite the lying little placard tucked neatly into its front display, which proudly boasted a 3 rating.
This has been Unlike Minded, a sci-fi audio anthology. Collection 2, A Traveler's Guide, stories about space, time, and other worlds. India Garden, Tandoor and Tikka was written and narrated by Cheech Manohar. Unlike Minded is an August year-round production, created, produced, and edited by Robbie Hyne. We'd like to give a special thank you to everyone who has supported this independent podcast production. You can keep up to date and find more info about this podcast and others on Instagram at the handle AugustYearRoundProd, or email us at augustyearround@gmail.com. And be sure to subscribe, leave a rating and review, and tune in next week for another episode of Unlike Minded. Thank you for listening.